Ian Reith.
And I'm Kyle Thompson.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit, and we are back with the third and final part of our series, reading Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake. This is good fun. These back a couple of chapters are really interesting, and it's been fun being on this weird fungal journey, hasn't it? You know?
Yeah, I've been really impressed with all of the things we read in here. Actually, had a couple interesting stories. One was that in chapter 6, Wood Wide Webs, they describe how, some plants will secrete what do they call it? Like an info chemical that attracts wasps to protect them from like aphids and other predators, right? Like, and actually, when I was visiting my mom last week, I saw this in action. In my mom's garden, there was a plant there that had sort of like an open weeping wound that it seemed like the wasps had inflicted on the plant. But the plant seemed fine at the same time, like it was healthy, even though it was weeping. And the wasps were just like all over it. And we were like, what the hell is going on here? Like, are the wasps like attacking the plant? And then I read this chapter and I was like, wait, no, actually what's happening is that the plant is getting the wasps to protect it from predators or like parasites and stuff, right? So that's like, that was so weird to have like that sync up in real time like that. Sent my mom an email as soon as I got back home. I was like, hey, I figured out what that was about. But there were a lot of wasps in that garden, so it was a little bit scary, you know. But you know, we're all good. And the other thing is, before we started reading this, there was a like mushroom art exhibit / kind of like pop-up market deal that happened in Calgary in the summer, and I went there and I got this like mushroom coffee that had like it's like coffee combined with like various powdered mushrooms. And I'm just drinking some right now because I was like, I'm gonna save this for like the last recording of this mushroom show. Because it was really interesting because you had some of those like amateur mycologists there, and then also like people who were doing like mushroom art. Like we bought this mushroom mug there that's really cool, that was done by a local potter. I think it's been, I think, as for like many other people, it's been a really interesting intro to the subject of mycology. And I'm definitely planning on sending one of these to my dad, who's a botanist, like sending the book to my dad, who's a botanist, because I'm sure he would get a kick out of all of this. Like, it would be super interesting to him, even though he's like mainly interested in grass. I'm sure there's like an angle at which he would be interested in fungi. Yeah.
Well, yeah, right. Yeah, totally, right. Because like, I mean, as our chapter 6 kind of gets into, like, the grass is probably tied together in a big distributed network with the fungi, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, no, I was just thinking, like, the other day, like, I was down by this lake in BC near my hometown, and, you know, my mom lives in, like, this desert area. Like, most of the plants are, like, shrubs or cacti, succulents of various kinds, tons and tons of cacti everywhere, right? Like not the big ones like you get down in the US, but just like little ones, like prickly pears and that kind of stuff. The ones that get through your shoes, and
oh no,
it's quite unpleasant. But there's a lake oh god, oh, yeah, I have like so much like climate horror to describe, but for my trip out to BC this year. But like essentially there's a lake that is in this desert area, fairly near to where my mom lives, and there's a park in the town of Savannah next to the lake. And in that park there are these huge deciduous trees, like truly like old growth. They must be old growth trees. Like I think they were oaks, I want to say. But there's one big one, and then there's like essentially I don't know how I would describe it. There's like kind of like a trio or like a triad of three huge trees that have grown together. Like they're all bunched up. I shared this in the GIU chat, but yeah, I was just thinking about how, like, you know, after reading the tree book and then reading Entangled Life, I was like, yeah, like these trees must like these three trees are probably actually all grafted together because they're right next to each other and like are enormous, so they have like huge root systems, right? And surely they've become like one organism at this point, right? Both through the fungi and also the grafting that we talked about in tree stories. And that was just super interesting because it's like, it's really interesting to see kind of enormous examples like that, that are so mature, but also, like these were like basically like maybe a 5-6 story building is about the size that you're talking about here, these trees. But it's also like kind of the only place of like, I don't know, shelter or comfort in that whole like desert area in the summer, because it gets so hot, everything's so arid and harsh and dusty, and it's like you go down by this tree and it's like you're in this microclimate that's been produced by these trees. And like my mom and her partner, they go there in the summer all the time when it's like super hot, like over 40 degrees heat, just to like exist. And it's like, yeah, this is all made possible by these things, these dynamics, these dynamics that we've been talking about in these two books. And I think that, like, yeah, this stuff is definitely only becoming more important, because when I was up in the, like, you know, I was up in the Rockies, traveling through the Rockies from Alberta to British Columbia, from east to west. And, you know, the last time I was really seriously up in the Banff area, which is like that really famous tourist area that everybody gets images of for like tourism promotions for Canada, there were still like glaciers around the town of Banff, like fairly sizable glaciers. But this time I went up there, and in the Banff area, all the glaciers were gone, completely gone. And at the very highest areas, there were still glaciers left. But when we came down the west side of the pass to where there were still glaciers left, all the glaciers were like filthy. They were just covered in ash because of all the forest fires. So that I believe is the reason that the glaciers disappeared in the other areas, is because in addition to the high temperatures, which, you know, we had like the heat dome go through there where they had like super high temperatures even at high elevations. The ash covers the glacier it lowers the albedo, the reflective quality of the ice, and that means it sinks more heat and increases the amount of melt. And then the glacier just gets into like a cascade of melting, because it's like once you have more melt, then the meltwater will like get under the glacier and start to melt the bottom as well as the top, right? And that has just like eliminated glaciers from areas my entire life. I cannot remember not seeing them there. Like, they will never come back in our lifetimes, I guarantee it. Because like there will be like prodigious amounts of snow over the winter, but it's not going to form a glacier. It will melt in the summer. And yeah, and then just even coming like, you know, past there further west into the interior of British Columbia, it was like, you know, we were driving at night. There was tons of smoke. It was hard to breathe. And then it was just like, you know, we were driving along the highway and you could see the forest fires up on the mountain ridges, just like burning like ominously in the darkness. and the river. So this is connected to the glacier issue that I was talking about. The river, the Thompson River, that runs through Kamloops, my hometown, which is enormous. Like it's like, I think, the largest tributary of the Fraser River, which is one of the largest rivers in North America. It was, the water was so low in the river that like there were sandbars appearing in the middle of the river, and there were sections of the river where the water level was so low that there was like kind of just a stream going through the riverbed, and that's all that was left. You know, it was like the river was like in danger of becoming a lake, you know, because the water level was getting so low. And it's like the amount of water that would normally in the past have flowed through there is like unfathomable amounts of liters and liters and liters and liters of water. And so like as the glacial melt, you know, becomes more severe, then yeah, like these water, like these rivers are going to be less and less glacier fed and more just, you know, a feature of like the rainfall and initial snow melt in the spring, right? And so it's like massive water supply issues, and also just like heat issues, and you know, tons and tons of trees this summer in that area died from either sudden temperature changes, or from extreme heat, or from the smoke, meaning that they were just not getting enough light. So it's really only the strongest trees that survived the summer. And, you know, those big trees I was talking about were like the one, like were fine because they had such an enormous root system and, you know, such an enormous canopy, and they created their own microclimate. And it's like people are going around cutting down old growth trees in British Columbia all the time. Like, it's a runaway problem. And it's like, these trees are, you know, yes, they're gold in terms of carpentry and stuff, but like they're gold in terms of like ecosystem survival and resilience as well, in a way that like nobody seems to understand, despite it being blatantly obvious in the extremes of climate that we are facing right now. You know, it's like what are they thinking? You know, there's just Like, it's like, we could just plant new trees. It's like, no, you fucking can't. What are you talking about? Like, if you go to a clear-cut zone in the climate that we have now and plant a bunch of saplings, like, they're not gonna make it. Are you kidding me? They're gonna die from the drought, or, you know, the wind, or whatever it is. You know, there's so many hostile factors.
Yeah. Well, what a novel concept, right? It's like what the author here and the author of Tree Stories are both imploring us to do is to look at these things as like living systems, you know, and not just like collections of inanimate objects just standing around in a field, you know.
Yeah, but you know what Heidegger literally called the standing reserve, right? It's just like everything just exists to be used. Yeah.
It's real fun, you know, watching a feedback loop turn into a feedback noose in front of your eyes, and nobody else seems to realize it.
Well, people are upset. I will tell you that. People are more upset there than they are here in Alberta, because it's worse there. It's a lot worse there. Like, it is, yeah, there's way more forest there to burn. The water supply is not as steady. You know, it's already very hot there. You know, people are upset and concerned. I don't think it's a matter of like people not recognizing there's a crisis. Like, even like, you know, watering your lawn was banned in Kamloops over the summer. So yeah, I think, you know, there's less of a head in the sand situation there than I would see here, for instance, or, you know, in Europe, right, where it's like, or in Northern Europe, I should say, where it's like, yeah, things are really weird, but they're not threatening per se, right? You know, in Southern Europe, it's like, holy shit, things are bad. But in the North, it's kind of like, wow, this is strange. But people aren't like panicking, you know? So it does depend where you are. But I don't think that matters to like forestry multinationals very much.
Oh God, no, absolutely. Yeah, let's dive into chapter 6, Wood Wide Webs. This is a really interesting chapter because it goes over the, I think, a fairly widely acknowledged notion that, you know, forests and, you know, large collections of plants are kind of linked underground by root networks and by fungal networks, these shared mycorrhizal networks. But the interesting thing here is that the author takes, like, the fungal perspective as, like, trying to explain why all this might happen, whereas it's usually the case that, like, people approach this from the trees perspective of like, okay, what would trees get out of this arrangement, and how would trees communicate with each other? Looking at it from the fungal perspective reveals a bit more and seems to, I think, offer more sensible explanations as to what's going on.
Yeah, it's like, instead of looking at trees as the actors who are connected to each other, like, directly, you think about the fungi as kind of like managers or brokers who exist in between these trees and will like allocate resources in order to ensure that they have as many sources of nutrients as possible. And in that way, sort of tending the forest garden in a way.
Yeah, that's the impression I got, really, is that if you take the fungal perspective, it looks more like the trees are livestock that is kept by the fungi, you know, as opposed to the trees being the primary agents that are involved. But yeah, the chapter gets into a lot of this stuff of like initially posing the problem, right? Because the first thing we're introduced to here is this plant, this flower, Monotropa uniflora, which is a ghostly white colour because it just doesn't have any ability to photosynthesize at all anymore. And so it's a, what's the term used here? Mycoheterotroph, I think, is the term used for organisms that they get their supply of carbons and sugars through a mycorrhizal network from other plants. And so this kind of immediately raises the question of like, fucking, like, why? Like, how does this fucking work? Like, by what, firstly, by what mechanism are they getting any of their food? And then also, like, why? Like, what are they exchanging? What's the reason for it? I think maybe, like, it's, the author kind of gets into a lot of this stuff, like, of, how nutrients move around in these networks and like what might be going on under the soil. And it's like, I don't know, maybe these ones are just pets is my kind of take. That like it's the same reason I keep a fish in the house, and it's like it's not doing anything for me, but like I still feed it, you know.
Yeah. It's really hard to say like what they supply to anyone else. It is kind of like keeping a house cat, you know. It's like it doesn't contribute much of anything to the economy of the house, but it's nice to have around, you know.
I think also this was the plant that the author was considering way back in the first chapters when he was trying to figure out, like, okay, what would it feel like to be a fungus, you know, and like, why would you partner up with this weird plant that doesn't seem to do anything? And then he kind of intuited that it might have something to do with shelter, that like having a docking station in those roots might be, it could even be a fucking warehouse. They just store carbon in there to move somewhere else, you know what I mean?
Yes. Well, and it's very funny because it's like, you know, does this plant necessarily perform those functions better than other plants in the area? Maybe, but like we don't really know, right?
Yeah, which I guess is something that the author does kind of bring up a fair bit, is that like it's super difficult to study any of these things. And it's hard to get a sense of what's actually going on. And part of it is like the restrictions of our kind of mental models of like how we approach things. And that like we need to try to approach things like from the fungal perspective, maybe try to understand them on their own terms, as difficult as that is, because it's really hard to take an inhuman perspective on things.
Yes, we need to think through metaphors and concepts in order to better understand how these things might behave.
One of the common themes that's raised a lot in this chapter is the notion of these being very big collaborative networks and like mutual aid. That there's a kind of huge like wood-spanning community that's doing a kind of the kind of dynamic, semi-planned economy that we're sort of quite fond of on this show, right? It's a kind of socialism of the soil, perhaps, or maybe it's completely deregulated Thatcherite fucking markets that's going on under the soil. You know, it's like
yeah,
it can be pretty hard to work out what's happening.
Yes, it is. It is very difficult because you're sort of working by way of like metaphor and analogy, and the metaphors or analogies you choose to think with are going to color the way that you're observing the phenomenon and like categorizing it. So that is only aggravated as an issue by how difficult it is to track activity within these systems, right?
Right. Yeah, there's some good stuff here about like experiments to like inject radioactive dyes into trees and see where they end up. And like, but even then, it's still a difficult thing to do, to try and track all this kind of stuff. And like, you know, some folks would try to map out as best as they could, map out like a network, like in, you know, in the network science kind of sense of like the network of this like couple of square meters of forest, you know, like identify all the plants involved, identify all the fungi involved. And even that's a colossal amount of work. And it's still only giving you a partial representation of this part of the network.
Yeah, because there could be sort of like, you know, like the kind of like intercontinental like internet trunk lines that are running through these networks that like you can't really observe if you are looking at a little plot of the forest. Like these like long distance, high bandwidth connections that might be sort of imperceptible if you are only looking at like one, I guess like 500, meters squared of forest or whatever, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's some, I kind of appreciated here the bit of variation on like, there's some experimental kind of confirmation for this idea, and there's also some folks that have kind of failed to replicate much of anything, and there seems to be a kind of debate going on that like, if these shared mycorrhizal networks exist, like, okay, fine, but like, are they like decisive? Are they of decisive importance to the plants? And like, if they were, like, what would it mean for them to be of decisive importance? Well, like, they would have to enable forms of life or arrangements of life that weren't possible otherwise. And the author then presents like the mycoheterotrophs as that kind of evidence, because like according to the author, like up to about 10% of plant species are like this, where they don't actually photosynthesize. They get their carbon, their sugars, and their nutrients from other plants via the network, that's pretty intense, right? Like it would be weird, because like I think if there was just one or two species that were kind of fucked up and weird, that would be one thing. But if like 10% of the plants in a forest are like this, something has to be going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Like it must be fit in an evolutionary sense in some way for that many plants to follow this pattern of evolution.
Yeah, I mean, even examples like orchids are kind of like this. Or, well, the author gets into a lot of these variations of like, the ghost flowers, they're like this constantly. That's fine. Orchids they don't contribute anything in their youth, but then they start contributing later. There's differentials in like, even amongst like, I don't know, spruce trees or whatever, there's differentials in like healthy individuals and sick individuals, or like very large ones contribute in overabundance. Overall, it kind of seems like resources seem to flow downhill, like things generally do in the universe, right? Like energy flows from high concentration to low concentration, and it tends to even out.
Yeah, like from the sun to everywhere on Earth, right?
To everything else. Yeah. So resources seem to be evened out in the network, but it's happening faster than just passive diffusion would allow for, and seems to be more directed than just diffusion. Which brings us back to that notion that maybe the fungi are deliberately... I mean, it kind of touches on the thing from the previous chapter, or I guess the thing we talked about last time, that like, if the fungi seem to be doing a buy low, sell high kind of strategy, or what they're doing is they're deliberately evening out resources, that like they're doing communist planning,
Yeah.
The fucking, what's that book that Tom is obsessed with? The fundamental principles of communist economics or whatever. They're just doing that in the soil, right? Like equalizing resources across disparate productions. That's a plausible model for what's happening.
In which case, like, these like mycoheterotrophs like might not actually be contributing much of anything, but they could just be sort of like tapping into the network and like kind of like siphoning off the excess, like just like people who are tapping into power lines and stealing electricity from the grid, right? Like that is a thing that happens all the time, and there's no reason plants couldn't do the same thing necessarily.
Right, and it kind of brings us to a lot of this discussion of like these very complex collaborations that are going on between species, and like there's some really interesting possibilities that are raised here. Like one that really jumped out at me was like that matsutake mushrooms tend to associate very closely with these candy cane monotropa, that have this red and white stripe to them. Like they don't have any green, but they have this weird red and white stripe. And you got to then ask, okay, why would it be fit for there to be a close association through the network between these two kinds of between this fungi and this kind of plant that doesn't seem to be contributing a whole lot. Like, what would the fungus get out of this association? But if we go back to like one of the earliest chapters about lures and allure, right? Matsutake mushrooms, they're a truffle, right? Like they really want to be dug up and eaten. So what better way to do that than to advertise your fucking presence with a red and white striped sign right above you?
That's right. Yes, exactly.
Isn't that fascinating, right? That like the author does mention that like perhaps one of the benefits that is gained here is that it kind of frees up evolution, right? That like if a plant is freed from the burden of producing its own food, it can evolve in whatever bizarro aesthetic direction it wants to. And okay, that's fine. It's cool art school kind of shit for the plant, but like that then weirdly is of benefit to the fungus to have these weirdly aesthetic looking plants above ground that indicate their own presence. That's an incredible kind of collaboration across species.
Yeah, no, for sure, 100%. It's very it's very much like the like male peacock feathers, right? Like massively impractical, but extremely useful for them.
Yeah, totally. It makes right. So, like for the peacocks, it makes sense to direct energy and resources into growing this thing that is attractive and that is fit in an indirect kind of way. And like, yeah, so the candy cane fucking plants are like the peacock feathers, but done through a surrogate, right? It's really incredible, and that's just one relationship we can pick out, right? What if all of the relationships between all of the plants and all of the fungi, and then all of them to everyone else, what if they're all that complex?
Yeah. No, exactly. And like, some of them can be obvious to us in a sense because like, they advertise themselves, and others are certainly more subtle. But there's so much to be learned. There's so much to be studied. Because as they go on and on about in this book, it's like these mycorrhizal networks, they kind of develop. I think this is in a sense it's not exhaustive, but it is kind of, I think, what the term terroir from French is referring to when they talk about how like, if you want to make this kind of wine, you got to grow it on this territory, on this land in particular. And there are the climatic conditions, like maybe that, like when we were talking in Tree Stories about how there was like that one really specific mountain range which was like so austere that it produced the longest living trees in the world. There is that climatic dimension, but there's also a good chance that there's like a very particular mycorrhizal network that has grown in that area, and is contributing to the flavor of the grapes and the wine in a way that cannot be reproduced simply through like agricultural arrangements. So yeah, like I think that because this kind of like terroir exists for mycorrhizal networks, like there's an enormous variety of phenomena to discover and study because there is like so much local variation. And it is kind of like they're all complex systems, like highly complex systems, in the sense that they can't really be reproduced in a laboratory. Like they kind of all require each other. It's like what is it like to like to build build a house, you first must invent the entire universe,
Right.
or something
Totally.
like that. Like it's like, yeah, like there's so many factors that are existing in balance with each other. Well, I would say dynamic equilibrium, or what do you call that? Disequilibrium, dynamic disequilibrium with each other is probably a more accurate way to describe it. Where you have sort of like, phase patterns of activity and recession, that exist between different dynamics in a way that creates this like song that the author keeps referring to. And that just means like the science that is possible with mycology is like enormous and vast, right? Especially like kind of like a mycological focused ecology, where you study like these mycoheterotrophs who are not themselves fungus but exist in a fungal context.
Yeah, right, absolutely. I don't know where it is exactly in the book, but like the author does kind of call mycology the neglected megascience.
Yes, it's, I think, in the next chapter. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a strong candidate for a science that you should probably pay attention to and do, but it's just weirdly neglected. And but the more people look at it, the more they look into it, it's like, oh, holy shit, like so much of terrestrial life on Earth and so much of like our lives really does depend on this stuff. But it's a kind of scary thing, right? Like it's kind of, I think you can almost detect that it's a kind of basilisk, right? Like people are reluctant to look at it because it reveals too much ugly stuff. That like you were saying, like I think if folks who are like, oh well, we'll just cut down a shitload of trees and we'll plant some new ones. That's a kind of neat, a very neat modern sort of way of thinking about things. And then when you point out that like, well, no, if you fucking destroy the soil while you do that and you kill off these communities, like these massive networks, it's not, your project just isn't going to fucking succeed. That's staring at the head of fucking Medusa, right? Like that's like realizing that does you harm.
Yeah, it's very much like sort of like the classic like Armando Iannucci like decision process comedy, where it's like can't we just make this problem go away? Like can't we just like oversimplify things vastly and pretend the problem doesn't exist? There's so much of that is thwarted or like sort of like niggled or problematized by looking at these complex networks, that is just very inconvenient to people who want to have very simple solutions to things, so that cost them less money and time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. That's it's the curse of contemporary, like modern kind of organization, right? Like that. Beer complained about the tendency of organizations to shoot the cat, like to radically simplify the problem they're solving, like by basically butchering the problem to make it fit the scale of like if you're a very simple organization with some very simple solutions to offer, you have to butcher the problem so that it fits the solution. And this just keeps coming up, right, over and over again, that we're constantly shooting the can in all kinds of ways. And when you point out that like not only is that action stupid, but it's also not going to work. That's the thing they fucking hate, right? Is like, it's one thing for their actions to be stupid, but for them to be failures, that's over the fucking line. Right?
Yeah, no, that's the thing that they really don't want publicized
to ever acknowledge. Yeah, right. Not only is this dumb, but it won't fucking work either. You know.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like, I don't know why this fucking reminded me, but it kind of did. That like, there's this thing that fucking happens, right? Especially with like authoritarian kind of styles of thought, where they drill into this extremely simplistic mindset. Like, because I think authoritarian patterns of thought often emerge in response to hyper complex situations, and the person goes into a clenched reflex and just decides, fuck this, I'm gonna like double down on strongman bullshit and I'm gonna fucking smash the problem. And but then it ends in fucking disaster, right? Like the 1,000-year Reich lasted 11 fucking years. It always ends in catastrophe.
or what we've learned about like the like pandemic response in China, where it was like when people were like revolting about the lockdowns, the government couldn't do anything because Xi Jinping was not in the country. And they literally couldn't do anything without him giving orders because everyone was so terrified.
The state, this supposed fucking wonderland of agency and possibilities, had kneecapped itself in its quest for simplicity.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's like it's sort of like the logical conclusion of the clench reflex is like the radical like authoritarianism, like sort of like returning to almost like the like enlightened despotism model of like the 18th century or whatever, right? Where it's just like, oh yeah, we'll simply get the emperor to do everything. That'll work. And like in, you know, Austria or Russia or whatever at that time. And then the lockdowns, right? It's like, oh, well, we have this really difficult problem of this pandemic and this viral spread, and our medical system isn't up to snuff to deal with this. And also, like, we are, for various reasons, like, unable to get the best vaccines, right? Cost, political barriers, etc., like geopolitical tensions, pride, all that kind of stuff. And so the answer is to just literally shut everyone away in boxes for like years. Like it's extreme clench reflex shit, right? Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the core of what, for me at least, like leads me to this kind of project and these kind of investigations is like, because I think like, you know, not only do we want, you know, systems and solutions that are humane and collaborative and stuff like that, we also want systems that actually fucking work, right? And the right wing just doesn't have anything to offer in that register of shit that actually works.
Yes, well, I think that the difficulty is that the difficulty here, I think, is that there is okay, so there is a variety of right-wing thought that is about radical simplification, right? And I think all right-wing thought, to a degree, tends in that direction. But we also have to remember that, like, organic agriculture has a pretty, like, fashy background in terms of where it comes from. And, like, the difficult thing is that, like, although, you know, Heidegger was certainly wrong in being, like, you know, obviously Heidegger was not, like, the founder of organic agriculture or anything, but he was, like, in the same vein of thinking, right? Is he, you know, he was obviously wrong in, like, appealing to Hitler as a god that could save the sort of, like, the Germanic heartlands from the predations of, like, you know, international Jewish godless capitalism. But he, like, the organic agricultural right-wingers were to a degree correct in their critiques of the disruption of the land by agricultural capitalism in a way that, like, socialists, I think, have definitely clocked over the years, but at the time in the mid-century generally did not appreciate, or I should say, especially, like, you know, social democrats and communist Marxists of various sorts, you know, there were, like, sort of anarchist communes and that kind of thing that were doing this kind of stuff because of their, like, connections to the peasantry and all that kind of thing. But there is definitely, like, a big L in the history of the left in terms of massively overlooking this problem in the 20th century, and then trying to, like, catch up with our own mistakes, while at the same time not simply becoming eco-fascists, right? Because the thing about ecofascism that is about radical simplification is that you just exclude anyone who is different and do things exactly the same way they've always been done in these like zones of ethnic reconstruction, where it's like you have to it's almost like you take what is kind of like a dynamic phenomenon in the countryside, and as like these like eco-fascists, you try to sort of like laboratize it by creating a stereotype of what that is and then like reconstructing it around that ideal, as opposed to like acknowledging the complexities of what's actually there. And I think that's the massive blind spot in this regard that you see on the right, in addition to, for example, like, you know, in this book, we see all of this like international cosmopolitan collaboration around mycological science. And that's something you would never get in a fascist regime, right? In an eco-fascist regime. The kind of like unity of science stuff that we see happening in amateur mycology and professional mycology right now is very much something that's a legacy of the left. It's just we're operating in a realm of science that has been ignored by the left in the search for like radical material plenty and improvement of living standards for large numbers of people.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're trying to correct things. It's going in a slightly better direction. Let's see what we got here. I think this part where we get to these infochemicals, which kind of like the pivot that the author uses here is that like it would be tempting to think of this as like a forest utopia, like pure mutual aid, but like really like these networks seem to convey a lot more than just conveying resources for everyone's benefit. You get weird kind of shit, like some plants produce poisons and send them out along the network, you know, to fuck up their competitors, you know?
They're like the black hat hackers of the Wood Wide Web, right?
Yeah. So what's shared in the network is a bit more ambiguous and ambivalent, in the sense that it's not exactly a kind of like purely virtuous kind of thing that's going on. Like the network is kind of like all networks are in some way value neutral, right? And we get this really interesting example then of these infochemicals, and how they're probably propagated through the network as well. That like some plants will send out a plume of volatile compounds to attract wasps when they're attacked by aphids. And basically scientists have observed that this kind of travels a distance that's implausible for it to just be going over the air. Like it has to be going through the network to really kind of affect these other plants. And it brings up this question of like, what is, there's clearly communication going on within the network, but what form does it really take? Is it that, does the plant deliberately send out an alert signal via the network? Or does the plant, the first plant to get attacked, does it just instinctively scream and the fungi pick up the signal and they deliberately relay it to everyone else as a way of protecting their livestock, perhaps? To me, the latter seems a bit more plausible.
Yeah, so, well, it's a difference. The way that this is traditionally being conceptualized, and this is not, like, as the author notes, this is not necessarily a helpful conceptualization, is the distinction between yelling "watch out" and or, you know, danger or something like that, and simply screaming because you're in distress, right? And again, this is like somatically problematic because like screaming that you're like because you're in distress can effectively be a watch out as well, right? Because people can interpret that as, hey, something bad's going on over there, right? Yes, the intent is what they're getting at. And again, it's like, well, okay, but obviously these plants don't have the level of cognition or I should say the type of cognition we have, because it's like, we have like, the whole like lizard brain, and then the prefrontal cortex and all these different complex cognitive systems that allow us to conceive the world in terms of volition and cognition. And so like maybe thinking in terms of that problem of intention is actually not very helpful here. Because it may obscure more than it reveals.
Yeah, totally right. Like, that is something that will kind of be, it's a bit of a theme in this later part of the book, is like kind of the problems of projecting our models onto these things, right? Like, is it, because it's just so tempting to read it in ways that correspond to us, right? Or maybe maybe it is something that's analogous to like maybe the two possibilities I named there, right? Like either the tree is the agent and it uses the internet basically to send an email to the plant next door to it, or maybe the plants are just kind of stupid and it's the fungus that's the agent that has the cognition that it recognizes a threat and then deliberately propagates a signal to all of its pets to like tell them to arm themselves for defense or whatever, or it's kind of both, right? Like it's a kind of weird machinic libidinal kind of complex that adds up to a behavior that's just not human. It's an inhuman behavior.
Exactly. So like if we think about, sort of the human body, right, and the endocrine system, like when we are in distress, or our body recognizes distress in some way, our endocrine system will just like dump all kinds of chemicals like cortisol and this kind of stuff into our system, right? Like to activate a fight or flight response to deal with the situation. It's very much conceivable that like when a plant is attacked, it just like floods its system in some kind of infochemical, right? As oh shit, we need to take whatever countermeasures we can, because the plants, the one thing they note is that the plants, if they are warned in some way or primed in some way to protect against the pest, they can take some chemical countermeasures to protect themselves, right? And so this is the value of the infochemicals being sent from one plant to the others, is that the other plants can prepare to defend themselves. But is there a message being sent of everybody watch out, get ready to fight? Or is it just a matter of like, similar to our endocrine systems, which tend to be very stupid, right? Like it's very lizard brain, right? It's just like, we have all kinds of situations. Like if you have PTSD, you have like all kinds of situations where you will have an extreme endocrine response to something that does not warrant it in any way.
To fucking nothing. Nothing happens.
It's simply a trigger mechanism, right? Like it is not a considered activation of the system. It is just your body saying, A looks like B, activate the oh shit button, right? That's all that's going on.
I'm very familiar. That happens all the time.
No, absolutely. It happens to me all the time, whether it's because of trauma or it's because of autism or it's because of, disability-induced trauma, right? Like, this shit happens all the time, and your prefrontal cortex is just trying to do the best it can to, pick up the pieces after your endocrine system has gone through the roof. Right? So it's very conceivable that, a plant could have that kind of, endocrine response, right? And then it's like, okay, so if it's going through its whole body and into its roots and connecting to the mycelial network, then yeah, there's going to be a lot available, but it's also possible that the fungi could just, give it that extra little boost, right? That like they were describing when they said that like the diffusion of nutrients happens faster than you would expect through just like simple like physical diffusion. It could be like, sort of like a packet handling system, right? Where it's like, oh yeah, these are higher priority packets, so they get sent through first, right? And that doesn't necessarily require a sophisticated like what do you call that, theory of mind in order for it to function. It requires decision and computation in a sense, but it doesn't really require analytical cognition and strategic thinking, like foresight thinking.
Absolutely right. And like this kind of, it's really tantalizing possibility that like if these mycorrhizal networks are these like integrated information systems that form some kind of weird little intelligence, like this could be and it rhymes with a lot of the stuff we've seen, right? That like the root networks and the mycorrhizal networks form this kind of extension of each other, that they add up to more than they could ever do alone. And it's like, is this a weird nervous endocrine system that's like distributed across the network? Is it a body without organs, basically? Like,
yeah, for sure. Because like, obviously the as we discussed, right, like the mycorrhizal network is a body without organs. They literally don't have organs. They have modalities, but they don't have organs. And plants have organs, but they, insofar as they exist in that network, they're kind of more of like, how do you say, like sort of like a chemical soup that is a part of this like broader, I don't know what you would say. It's almost like sort of like a hydraulic network or something like that, right? Like it's very, very permeable, very, very mobile, and each one is just because the plant is like organized doesn't mean that it's, if you sort of look at it holographically as a part of the mycorrhizal network, it doesn't mean that is the overriding factor in its existence.
Yeah, it's bizarre stuff. It's it really challenges our kind of concepts of like individuality and what exactly is a living thing, right? Because like there's a lot of living things in this network that aren't really capable of surviving on their own. And that is reciprocally true of a bunch of them with each other. It's strong evidence for some kind of strange superorganism that is just fucking out there constantly beneath our feet, and we walk around and we don't give a fucking shit about it, you know?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's 100% like, like Princess Mononoke, right? Like, just the humans, the civilized humans just utterly fucking things up in a very ignorant way.
The chapter closes out a bit on touching on kind of neuroscience, like if these networks are complex adaptive systems, which they seem to be, then the mycologists are getting a little bit of extra help from neuroscience, which is the other science that studies complex adaptive systems, not making a claim that the mycorrhizal network is a brain in that sense, but that like they share a lot of the same characteristics.
Yeah, I mean, it's a brain in the way that Beer meant it, but not necessarily in the way that a biologist or an anatomist or physiologist would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's see, Chapter 7, Radical Mycology. This chapter is largely about at a high level, it's about the transformative powers of fungi and how they've been deeply involved in many world transforming events in the past and seem to be kind of pivotal to the current transformation we're going through. This initially kicks off on their powers of decomposition. This shit is insane, right? Like, because the short version of the story here, I guess, is that when plants came out of the ocean with the help of fungi, they didn't initially have wood.
Well, the story actually starts with the author describing how they're vibing in a what is essentially like a fungus hot tub.
This is like this.
So it's like a practice that comes from Japan. I mean, obviously Japan has like a very sophisticated history of using fermentation because well, there's a number of different reasons, but like one of them is just that like by default there isn't a lot of very interesting flavors found in Japan. Like it's a very sort of like neutral food palette by default, and a lot of the sort of like accents to food in Japanese food come from fermentation as opposed to using spices or extremely high levels of salt, which is what you found in European cooking, existing in a kind of similar climate. But of course, there's all kinds of like things they learned from like Chinese medicine or like practical industrial processes they learned from fermentation. And also, like beyond just sort of like food health practices, it goes on to things like these fermentation baths. So you essentially just take a bunch of wood shavings, you wet them down, pile them up into a heap, and then you put them in a big wooden tub, and you make sure the fungi are there. And then the fungi will just start to decompose the wood. And because of, the nature of, like the chemical process they're going through, that creates heat. And so your fermentation tub essentially becomes a hot tub, and you can just like pop yourself down in there and have a nice hot tub experience by like cooking yourself, kind of
largely. I think I would not be able to do this. I'd be too scared. Like, this is fucking weird.
I would absolutely do this. I would be down with this. I've done the thing in Japan where they like bury you underground, like on the beach. It's like you get in like a kimono, and then they just like take like hot sand and like bury you in it. And your head's poking out, obviously. And you just sort of lie there and you just have a nice little like cozy time. And this sounds like a good time as well, although I'm sure the smell is profound.
I think so, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think I would be a little bit worried they would start eating me, probably, I've learned to fear and respect the fungi through this book.
It's like, don't worry, they're only eating you very slowly.
Yeah, it's not going to take very quickly. Maybe it'll be fun, yeah. But yeah, so like, I mean, the book goes into a lot about how this process was even enabled in the first place, because initially plants just didn't have wood involved, but they were under an evolutionary pressure to get taller so they could get more sunlight, and so wood is the way you do that because it's more structurally resilient than the usual kind of stuff plants are made out of. But the thing about the wood, which is made up of, so ordinary plant stuff is made up of cellulose, but wood is made of lignin. Plants invented a way to create this kind of shit, grew very tall, then fell over and died, and then did it over and over again, leaving behind these fucking mountains of just wood lying around.
It's like if you imagine like a clear-cut zone, right, of like all of these trees that have been felled and not harvested yet, of just like the chaos, or like if you see like when that that asteroid hit Russia, and there was just like that area that was like an area of forest that was completely flattened by the shockwave. If you just imagine that, but like the entire Earth covered in that.
Just covered in dead trees that are not rotting because fungi have not figured it out yet.
Yeah, there's no decomposition. There are obviously there's obviously plants growing on top of the plants. So this isn't quite what you imagine as that disaster zone, but the degree of biomass is what you should think about there, and then some.
And during this period, colossal amounts of carbon dioxide are pulled out of the atmosphere and turned into wood, which just fucking piles up to the heavens. Because nothing can break it down yet. Eventually, fungi figure out how to break this stuff down with these... it's explained in some detail here, but basically, some fungi release some enzymes that are able to break it down. Like, lignin has a very particular structure to it. A lot of enzymes will just bounce off like Teflon. If you can figure out these particular enzymes, let me see if I can quickly find the word for them.
Peroxidases?
Peroxidases, that's what it is. They're able to break down lignin, and finally, fungi can get at this resource to decompose it.
The plants induced an ice age, and it wasn't until the fungi just discovered how to metabolize or decompose all this biomass that the carbon balance of the atmosphere went up again, and the ice age ended, right?
Right, because huge ice age. Plants suffered greatly at the hands of the thing they had created for themselves. Does that remind anyone of anything? The levels of CO2 had crashed. When fungi decompose wood or decompose anything, it releases energy and CO2 back into the atmosphere, which warms the place up again. But crucially, a lot of this stuff had sank out of reach of the fungi, and that's how you get coal. Coal is the piles of wood that just the fungi couldn't get to, and just was totally undecomposed.
Yeah, and like oil, essentially fossil fuels of any kind that are found in quote unquote nature.
So when you see a rotting lump of wood out in the wild, that's it's doing this chemical combustion. Like fungi are chemically combusting that wood, and then when you pick up a lump of coal and burn it, you're just doing a different kind of combustion on the same material, which is pretty strange.
And we get this absolutely wild statistic. It says, today, fungal decomposition, much of it woody plant matter, is one of the largest sources of carbon emissions, emitting about 85 gigatons of carbon to the atmosphere every year. In 2018, the combustion of fossil fuels by humans emitted around 10 gigatons. So we're at as absolutely out of control as our emissions are, we're at 1/9 of what fungi release into the atmosphere per annum.
That is fucking incredible.
And it also just kind of presents the counterfactual world where it's not just wood, but animal bodies when they die, they don't decompose because fungi aren't there, and we just have piles and piles and piles of corpses everywhere.
Yeah. Oh, insane. That is absurd. Oh my god. That's the insane thing about this, that life took off on a fucking crazy trajectory and just piled up biomass up to the fucking heavens, and nothing could be done about it for a while. I don't know. Yeah, absurd.
It is unreal. It is really, truly bizarre to think about where all of these fossil fuels come from. And the other thing they noted is coal will be decomposed by fungi if you just leave it sitting out, because it's been exposed to the air, unlike the coal underground. And also there is a particular kind of fungus that gets into the fuel tanks of jets and decomposes jet fuel. And I assume this also is part of the reason why if you leave gasoline in your gas tank too long, it'll go bad. Is because there's fungi in there that are bringing it down. Like you hear about the sort of the way that it will decompose into like water. If just left in your gas tank, it will like destabilize and decompose into water, and then you get water in your gas, and then it doesn't burn as well, blah, blah, blah. But like, I never heard of or thought of the factor that, yeah, there's probably just like fungi in there just eating away at what you've got in your gas tank and ruining your gasoline. but having a really good time.
Amazing, right? It's fucking incredible. The chapter then kind of moves on to, this notion of mycology as a neglected megascience, and how there's this substantial like amateur world of mycology. One obvious branch is the psychedelics thing, but there's also like a lot of folks working on what they call mycoremediation, like using fungi as a way to remediate like damaged ecosystems. Like if you have an oil spill, just chuck a bunch of fungus on it and it'll clean it up pretty quick, this sort of idea.
Yeah, I mean that's the idea. It's not that, unfortunately it's not that simple.
Yeah.
But this is what they're working on. And mainly the kinds of fungus that they are using are what are called white rot fungi. And originally, these are the fungi that were able to produce that peroxidases to break down lignins. But it turns out that they're also really good at breaking down all kinds of other toxic shit that happens to be in the world.
The core insight is that fungi really do thrive on catastrophe and rot, and they do the rot, but they thrive on leftover crap and toxins from other processes. So they could they've trained fungi to break down cigarette butts, which I think is a really fun image of this unhappy little mushroom being goaded into eating cigarette butts.
Yeah, they sort of did like exposure therapy to the fungus, right? Where it's like it starts out with like normal like wood chips or whatever that are, the fungus is being fed, and then as time goes on, they introduce more and more cigarette butts into the environment, and the fungus apparently has sort of like a latent repertoire of enzymes it can use, and it takes a while for it to activate dormant ones and deactivate active ones. But if you can goad it into switching to a effective enzyme, it can do something like decompose and metabolize cigarette butts.
And, like, crucially, the mushrooms that are produced are non-toxic. Like, it filters and cleans out all that crap and just breaks it down.
Which is, like, unbelievable. It's like, what? It's, like, the most toxic shit you can imagine. There is something truly out there about cigarette smoke. Like, it's like, I have a really, 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 really sensitive respiratory system. And, I can pick out the smells of things, like, wherever I go. But compared to, say, like, forest fire smoke, right? Like, wood smoke. Cigarette smoke is, like, one person lights up in the general vicinity of where you are with a tiny little cigarette, and all of a sudden you're like, oh fuck, it's like I can't breathe, my sinuses are going crazy, my throat's itchy for like 4 hours later, and it's like, it is so toxic. And the fact that the fungus can turn this into just like a normal ass mushroom it's incredible.
Yeah, it's amazing, right? There's another example of them using, again, this rather unhappy image of being coaxed into eating used diapers, and just like it, but it does it like a champ. Once you like make it, once you force it to like rifle around in its bag of tricks to find something that can do it, yeah, it does it like a fucking champ.
Oh yeah, it's wild because you could conceive of a world like, you know, they sort of talk about later in this chapter. It's kind of jumping ahead, but essentially how we can use mycelium as a plastic, right? And it's wild to think about the future where we could have children's disposable diapers made out of mycelium, and then those diapers are also consumed by fungi to make mushrooms or whatever the fuck, right? Fuels, whatever. I don't know, but it's like that would be such an incredible waste reduction. And it in a way, it's kind of like, if you think about the fact that plastic polymers are produced out of fossil fuels, it's sort of like you're short-circuiting the process of going from fossil fuels to plastics to decomposing the plastics with fungus, right? Because the fungi were already able to decompose the biomass in the first place, right? But instead of doing that, you just go straight from like, you know, whatever biomass to producing mycelium to decomposing the mycelium with other fungi.
Right, absolutely. Like it's and that's kind of the heart of like the remarkable metabolic trick these things pull off, right? That like they're so fucking good at this, and they're so good at creating like solid matter out of fucking anything, you know? And we have these like sad imitations like plastic science or whatever the fuck, and it's like, okay, if we happen to have a big fucking thing of oil lying around, we can turn it into, you know, toys and fucking phones and stuff or whatever. But like the fungi laugh at that shit. They're just like, I'll turn anything into more mushroom, you know?
Yeah, but the thing is, like, the thing that is interesting about it is like, okay, so, you know, the fungi don't have organs. They have these kind of like modalities, right, that they can exist in, and they, you know, they do produce structures in the form of mushrooms, right, and in terms of these mycorrhizal networks. But like, we can get the fungi to mold into shapes, and like all kinds of shapes that our imaginations can come up with, and that's something that they can't do, right? And so like there's all these kinds of like interesting creative possibilities that are made possible by the idea of like not just creating mycelium, by creating molded mycelium. And they even talk about like impregnating the like not in a literal sense, but like including like electrically conductive minerals and components into the mycelium in certain molds in order to create like circuits that have been built within the mycelium. So then when you dry it out, you have like a computing system or information communication system that has been like built into the structure of the thing that you have created, almost like making like you know, like a silicon microchip, but in a living, growing thing.
Yeah. It's really intense, right? Like it's and like that's the pivot from the decomposition to the construction. We get there via the termites that farm fungi, and like that's fucking nuts, right? These African macrotermes termites. These guys, they build enormous structures. Well, like, and you might ask, what the fuck do they do in there? Do they sit around and, you know, just play Xbox or whatever? No, they farm fucking fungus, right? Like, they have these ants have like a technological mass society that's built around agriculture, and the reason they build the mounds is so they have a controlled climate. Like, they invented AC like 30 million fucking years ago so they could farm fungus. And it's the fungus that digests their food for them. They take the wood chips. This is why they go after wood, right? This is why termites love to eat wood. Well, they don't eat it. Well, in a very indirect way, they do. They grab the chunk of wood, they bring it home, chuck it onto the pile of fungus. The fungus breaks it down and spits out all these delicious juices or whatever. And it's that stuff that the ants feed on. It's externalized digestion in a technological mass society that's a lot fucking older than ours.
Yeah, because like these termite mounds that are built out of like sort of the, I mean, it's kind of like this macro structure where it's like you build the fermentation chamber and then it just keeps growing and growing out of the waste of the chamber, right? And some of these last like, what is it, like hundreds of years. They've existed as like cities of termites. And so that's like on par with like various human cities. Like my hometown is about 200 years old. That's it's like the same age as a termite mound.
They're going to be around a lot longer than your town is. I'm sorry to break it to you,
I think so, yeah. And I mean, I love also the story of how people like use the termites to fuck over the French. The French colonizers, they were doing sabotage by introducing termites into like the colonial administration buildings so that they would like, they ate up all the colonial records. Like, can you imagine? Like, it's like, oh, like, no, the permanent records are gone. Like, we can't do a colonialism. We can't categorize people. Yeah, it's just amazing.
Yeah, I think that's incredible, right? Because like, at some point in this chapter, it's noted that fungi just are a kind of voracious hunger in a bodily form. Like, they're just pure appetite, and like termites have the reputation for being pure appetite as well. But it's an extended phenotype via a different species.
It's because they're feeding the fungus, and the termites is also interesting because the fungi that is produced in the termite mounds is huge and also considered a delicacy. But it's another one of these fungi that have been impossible to produce in a controlled human environment because the micro regulation of the temperature and the oxygen, the gases that are available for the fermentation that is done by the termites is so sophisticated that we haven't been able to replicate it. And so it's like, yeah, like they not only build these structures, engage in all this organized activity, I mean, literally cannot live without this symbiosis with the fungus because their food source is entirely dependent on this fermentation. But they also do this really, really sophisticated like HVAC work.
They've got AC.
Yeah, exactly.
They've had it for longer than we've had. It's incredible. And like, I don't know, just what a wonderful example of like a natural, like non-human cybernetic system, like a goal-directed, feedback-driven mega system that's composed of all kinds of high variety parts. Like, it's incredible.
Yeah, and they were talking about how like people in it's like West Africa, right? West African areas, like they like worship the termites as like divine beings, and like there's like a creation myth about how like God required termites in order to make the universe.
To build, yeah, exactly. Like, they're builders.
It was like, well, I can't do it without the termites. Which is so great.
That is incredible, right? And like that role, that notion of building is the pivot into this fairly long discussion of like using mycelium as a construction material, like deliberately growing, just feeding shitloads of sawdust and crap to these things and building bricks and leather and all kinds of shit. Which, you know, it can be summarized as that, basically. There's all kinds of companies doing this, and trying to and having some serious success with it.
The main one they mention is this company Co-Renewal, which has like a patented construction process and what sounds like really sophisticated means of production in order to roll out just like tons and tons and tons of mycelium. And, you know, they're using it in all kinds of interesting ways, some of which are horrifying, like working for the Pentagon. But they do also seem to have, like, some kind of, like, what do you call that? You know, it's like at the beginning of, like, the enshittification curve, where, like, the company will make something available to users in a very sort of like open and productive way. Like, I don't remember what exactly that phase is called, but they seem like I'm not as optimistic about this company as the author is necessarily, because I know that enshittification is a thing. Right? But like essentially they will like license out their technology to groups of amateur mycologists or communities or whatever who want to use it to build something or other or experiment with something or other. And then they can go on and like use it for like their particular niche cases without having to pay huge license fees. But again, we know enshittification exists, so how long is it until the license fees show up? How long is it until they create some kind of like capitalist like lock-in mechanism? How long is it until this becomes Unity but for mushrooms, right? Like I'm skeptical, but I do appreciate that what they're doing in a like material sciences sense is like very, very cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, it's like how long until they pull an oracle on this. But I kind of hope that the grassroots amateur mycology stuff can keep that in check, or somewhat. There's a kind of like open source substrate to this stuff that might be harder to contain, I guess, you know, if folks are able to just replicate it on their own. I think one of the final like interesting points in the chapter is I think we've sort of avoided naming some of the folks that are named here, but like there's this guy Paul Stamets who's kind of a big deal in this kind of world, and he had this kind of realization, like thinking about the problem of like honeybees getting fucked over by parasites and this, you know, decline in bee populations, and kind of realizing that these wood rotting fungi are very rich sources of antiviral compounds, right? Like, and there's a lot of you know, health research and pharmaceutical research going into that. But he also just kind of connected the dots and having seen in his childhood, having seen bees kind of crawling under a rotting wooden stump, seemingly to get at the mycelium under it. And that he's then developed kind of a cure for bee diseases from fungi, right? And it's just another one of these points of like the deep involvement of fungi in all kinds of life processes and the kind of cross-species collaboration that's constantly going on here. So like Stamets is able to invent and kind of market this miracle cure for bees off the back of having just realized that like they were doing that anyway, you know, like bees have been self-medicating themselves with the antiviral compounds from fungi for a long time, you know.
Well, it's very much like the wasp defense scenario that we were talking about earlier, right? Like we can play the role of the mycorrhizal network and just be like, oh, you're doing this? Let me help you do that, right? Let me spread this a little bit further in order to provide a protection against the pests that are killing the bees.
Yeah, like we're getting roped into the fungus story, and the way it keeps its livestock going.
And I did just want to correct myself. The company I was talking about earlier is actually Ecovative, ecovative. I misspoke earlier, but for the record, that's what it is.
Yeah. The final chapter, making sense of fungi, is, I think, quite interesting, but what it really hinges on is the kind of roles that fungi have played in our sense-making. Like, we've been using them, especially yeasts, for a long time to alter our minds and to... I don't know, like a lot of our culture and stuff seems to be built around the collaboration with yeasts, right? Like, and, they play a role in myth. We have the gods of drunkenness and this sort of thing, right? But, like, also kind of getting to the ultimate point that, like, the stories we tell matter, right? And they especially matter when we're investigating something in the world, right? That, like, when we go out and we look at fungi, we do any kind of science, really, we're necessarily bringing along these metaphors and these biases with us. I think we touched on this earlier, but, like, looking at the shared mycorrhizal networks, some people see socialism of the soil, others see deregulated markets, others see, like kinship networks among trees, like a family structure or whatever. We can't help but bring these kind of things to the table, but then, hopefully our study of the thing feeds back on itself, like in this kind of wonderful cybernetic way that, like, if we can try to understand fungi on their own terms, we learn something about ourselves and about them, and it feeds back and it keeps going. There's a lot of really interesting stuff in here, but I think that's kind of what it really hinges on.
Yeah, there's this Haraway quote at the start of the chapter. It matters which stories tell stories, which concepts think concepts, which systems systematize systems. So this is the second order cybernetics idea, right?
There's some really interesting examples that are brought up here that of, like, people bringing, like, that like, when people talk about fungi, they're often telling on themselves more so than they realize, like, that there's these kind of, like, generally, like, mycophilic versus mycophobic kind of perspectives, or, like, cultures, I guess, right? Like, you can kind of observe this. There's one example here of Charles Darwin's granddaughter, Gwen Raveray, maybe, I can't pronounce things, describing her Aunt Etty, right, which was Darwin's daughter, and her weird obsession with stinkhorn mushrooms, which have this, like, really insane, like, phallic appearance. And so Aunt Etty would, like, go around the woods trying to dig these fucking things up and, like, get rid of them or whatever. And it's like, there's something weird going on there, right? Like, somebody who claims to be utterly repulsed by these things spends a lot of time thinking about them. There's clearly some really intense psychosexual derangement happening there. And doesn't that reveal, like, our relationship with the fungus reveals something of ourselves, right? And that, I don't know, there's a nice story here of, like, our investigations into these things being ways of, like, revealing something in ourselves, right? Like, what we see in the fungus tells a story about ourselves.
It kind of reminds me of how in Tree Stories, there's the story of how, like, all the garbage in New York was handled by the pigs that they brought in. But then because the pigs were having sex in the streets, that they were like, we gotta get rid of them. You gotta get rid of these pigs. Like, we can't have them around. It's obscene. It's obscene. Even though, like, the answer, like, in the absence of that was to, like, train an entire army of garbage people to go around and pick up garbage when the pigs were just doing it for free and also providing food. So, like, it's very like the Aunt Etty, like, tried to purge obscenity from nature, but, like, really just kind of, like, telling on herself and making a bit of a fool of herself too, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. The author also kind of suggests that, like, when we come with all these biases to studying fungi, maybe the answer is to kind of step back and try to see the fungi as agents in themselves and see the many relationships among many agents, right? Like the fact that the fungi, that the lichens are not just the product of fixed partnerships, but, like, they're products of these dynamic partnerships. They're an array of possible relationships among a number of players, right, that like emerge into lichen. And to really make sense of fungi, you probably have to step back and think about this along continuum. Like it's not that they are, you know, necessarily all about mutualism or they're necessarily all about competition. There's a lot of both going on in those networks.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Which is like kind of what we see everywhere. It's like where life is involved. I mean, it's like, yeah, like, I mean, oftentimes I think as socialists, we're very much inclined to emphasize the cooperative dimension of things because we're surrounded by a capitalist society where cooperation is entirely bent towards the ends of competition. It's not that it doesn't exist; it's that it's essentially like, you know, perverted into something that is highly antagonistic and destructive. But like, you know, if you just look at the natural world, it's really, really, really easy to find examples of competition everywhere you look. Like you just have to be, you just have to observe for like any length of time and you will find it, right? And it's not to say that, you know, yeah, competition is the law of the jungle, blah, blah, blah. It's just to say, yeah, you have to be able to hold two ideas in your head at once. And this isn't to argue in favor of market socialism, because that was a lot of their sort of shtick, but, you know, because they were like, well, we have so much cooperation in socialism, but we don't have enough competition. But it was like, if you actually looked at how like socialism, like, you know, sort of actually existing socialism existed, that wasn't true at all, right? Like, yeah, there was something I guess you could call cooperation, but only in like the most sort of like anemic sense, you know, like it's like the like sort of the most like cooperation under duress, and like the way that sort of the constant exhortations towards cooperation and altruism, like conversely bred the worst forms of cynicism in people.
Yeah, because it was all a moral kitsch, right? Like the whole shit about like comrade or whatever the fuck. Like, no, and at that point, nobody believed it. It's like, this is insane, right? Like, we're clearly at each other's throats.
They know, but nobody believed it because it was all under duress, right? And we get a similar kind of thing whenever like companies, like workplaces, try to emphasize the cooperative dimensions of the workplace, like calling it a family or a team, or, you know, we're all in this together, etc., etc. It just brings out tons of cynicism in people because it's all under duress, right? And so it's like, I don't think the market socialist line was actually correct, because they made assumptions about socialism that weren't really sociologically founded, right? And assuming that competition was the answer to these problems, when actually it's probably something more, I guess, of my own biases, to do with the sort of like the dynamics of the society and the degree of freedom that exists, right? That is the problem. And to turn it into a cooperation versus competition dichotomy, is maybe a bit missing the point. And I think it's kind of the same with these mycorrhizal networks, right? Is like, you have to be willing to see like how these dynamics play off of each other. And they do it in a kind of, like a dynamic way. Like, you know, it's like when they were talking about how, what was it? The altruistic fungus, if you like put two of them together, in the same environment, they would become competitive with each other, right? Even though we assume that they're sort of inherently altruistic in the same way that like Stalinism had this kind of idea that like if you came from a working class family, that made you somehow like essentially a worker, and you would get like higher promotions within the bureaucracy because of your background. When it's like, well, no, but if you put somebody into a bureaucratic context like that, they're going to be a different person than they were as a worker. And there's no sense in having this kind of like genetic essential notion of sociological status, right?
Yeah, absolutely right. And like, yeah, I guess one of the points here is that like these kind of simplistic models that are informed mostly by our biases are just always going to be problematic. And if you pursue a project based on them, it's just going to end in fucking catastrophe one way or the other, because it is a simplistic misapprehension of the world, right? If studying fungi, or as you said, studying fucking anything in nature really does indicate that any sufficiently complex living system will be riddled with contradictory dynamics that still somehow often end up being stable and persistent in time overall. So we can look at the fungi and their networks and think, oh shit, is it competitive or is it cooperative? But like zoom out and see that like they have been the custodians of life on the surface of the earth for a long fucking time, and they've been extremely successful doing it. The forest outside your fucking house or whatever is more persistent than you are, and much more fucking successful at staying alive in aggregate. Maybe take a hint from nature and say that like, whether it's entirely cooperative or entirely competitive, clearly the aggregate result of this hyper-complex system is a thriving and flourishing of life that is just very fucking successful. And if we're looking towards, like as socialists, we're looking towards persistent, successful social relations that actually thrive and flourish through time, that, we might want to embrace the hyper-complexity of those situations and not be quite so obsessed with one or the other of the poles of these dichotomies, because the dichotomies are just false, right? And that can be quite uncomfortable like territory to be in, because I think honestly a lot of socialists really have committed to very simplistic, like laughably simplistic models of the world.
Well, yeah, I mean the thing is it's not that the dichotomies are false necessarily when I think about it, but they're like relative and positional, right? It's like, yes, you can be like competitive in this context and then switch over to being more cooperative in another context. And yeah, it's like they're not essential poles, they're part of a dynamic process. And yeah, like it's difficult to put this into practice because we want to be suspicious of what like organizations we engage ourselves in, right? Like we want to be skeptical, and in a way, like, if somebody is saying everything's all relative, it's all dialectics, blah blah blah, you can get away with anything, right? You can get away with anything. You say, oh, it all works itself out in the long run, all this kind of thing. It kind of cycles back to being its own problem, right? Where it's like the idea of like the Leninist future will be perfect, so any amount of suffering is worth it. It kind of ends up like in the same place as like this like implementation of a horribly predatory system in our socialist organization is only a stage towards the greater utopia of balance and the long run development of what we experience. And so, like, I think it is about, in a way, like being quite open to observation and having a variety of these, like, what Haraway calls stories that we can operate with, because it's only under like careful scrutiny that we can actually say anything more than stereotypes, right?
Yeah, certainly, right? And, accepting that no single story is going to capture everything. Like, we have to have an array of stories and a kind of, an array of stories and a kind of set of values by which to, like, navigate that, space of, like, which stories are, attractive to us. Which I guess is, again, kind of rhyming a lot with what we read in Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal, right? Like, we can't expect any given model or any given story to be the one silver bullet, right? Like, the verticalist fucking Leninist organization is the one true party, all that kind of shit, or the distributed fucking just mass of the anarchist stuff. Neither of those are going to cut it. Like, everything is always going to be in this kind of mixed mode, and so, like, mycorrhizal networks are like that. And, like, I what I love about all this is, like, that it does rhyme with a lot of the, like, political theory stuff we've been reading, and with a lot of the system stuff we've been reading. That, like, if we take a mycelial perspective and we think of, like, a mycelial logic of social organization, would we be better off than just recycling the same old shit that we've been recycling?
Right, and this is the big question. Can we do something with this conception of networks that isn't the same as the network conception that was criticized in from between vertical and neither vertical nor horizontal, right? Where we had the anarchists who said everything would just work itself out because networks. Like, can we do something with this new form of, I guess I should say this expanded form of natural science, that allows us to think differently, organize differently, and be responsive and constructive and dynamic, as opposed to being self-sabotaging or self-defeating.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think we could learn a lot from the dynamism and the variety proliferation we see in fungi. They're incredibly successful organisms, and they do it on the back of a radical openness, and a radical variety that is really kind of scary to us, being that wide open.
Yes, exactly. We will always have a tendency towards organization, I suppose, in a way that they do not. But we can try to sort of think more modally, more dynamically, more like the hyphae than like building blocks,
Yeah. The final part of the book, the epilogue, it's just kind of it's a strange little story of kind of how the author got to where they are in terms of, like, making the book. When they were young, they were obsessed with these piles of leaves that would pile up in autumn, and then over time would become smaller and much less leaf-like and more soil-like. So they went, the author went and asked his dad about all this, and got into. Realized what decomposition was, what these decomposers were, and got obsessed with fungi. It's a really cute little story. He then says that, like, he's going to take a copy of the book and feed it to the fungi and see what mushrooms come out of it, and have a little nibble on them. It's good stuff.
Yeah, I will eat my book.
I do wonder how that turned out, right? If it was tasty.
I mean, it's really interesting, right? That, like, it feels very sort of like Caves of Cud, just like applying a truly bizarre verb to an unexpected noun. Yes, I will render my book edible now, and then I will eat it. That's the sort of strange plastic nature of fungi, right? Of sort of like metamorphosing things into other things. It's very, very, very bizarre, and yet at the same time very familiar and intimate, if we could just open our brains to it.
I noticed that these last couple of chapters didn't have quite so much of the sexual themes and the kind of relationship themes. Well, I guess the whole book is about relationships, but there's less of that erotic content that was in some of the earlier chapters.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of it that comes up, but less for sure. I think it's because it has to do more with human uses of fungi in industrial capacities, and also it has to do with sort of like cognitive modes, right? Like constructive cognitive modes. So it's a little bit focusing more on the mycologists than the fungi and their relationships, right? And so it may be in fact useful to go back and look at what's examined in those final chapters, and then think about it in that relationship, sensuous kind of erotic way that is found in the earlier chapters of the book. Like, what is, like you think about something like, they just sort of talk about like, what do you call it? Like substitute leather or fake leather or artificial leather or whatever. And it's like, yeah, like we have a very sensuous relationship to leather, which you could go and examine, right? Like it is not like it isn't there. It's just maybe by moving into that more sort of like human society frame, we are like obscuring it in the way that like Darwin's granddaughter was a bit obsessed with doing.
Right, totally. It is there, I guess. I think there was one other thing from that last chapter that I kind of forgot to mention, that like the author does kind of go over like how, again, it's a kind of repetition of something from earlier in the book, that like you're trying to categorize, like we generally go around trying to categorize things, right? Like it's the Aristotelian project of science, right? To stick things into categories by their similarities, whatever. But like fungi totally defy this. Like they blast categories apart, that like the same species of fungi can just turn into all kinds of different shapes that don't look anything like each other. Like if you came with a Aristotelian mindset to categorize them, you'd get it totally fucking wrong. And to the extent that like some mycologists have suggested just giving up on the species notions of fungi, is just like, because it's to some of them it seems like it's an actual just fantasy, the notion that there are even species there.
Right. It's like a fantasy that we are. It's sort of like geocentrism, right? Or adding tons of epicycles to the Ptolemaic astrological system, right? Or astronomical system. That it is. We're kind of patching up our understanding of realities to make it fit with a story that doesn't actually describe things very well.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, there's definitely a utility in having your categories levered apart by consideration of something that just defies your categorizations. And it might make you reassess things. It's like, I mean, maybe I've just been harping on this a bit much, but like, yeah, if you're somebody who cares about changing the world for the better and you're a bit dissatisfied with where actually existing socialism ended up, maybe levering those categories apart and reconsidering everything in the context of what's actually observable is worth doing in the same way.
Yeah, and the other thing that's sort of nice about these final chapters is they talk a lot about how, I guess sort of in the same way as what early health insurance looked like, because these mycological solutions to problems are finicky and quite alien to our typical ways of doing like materials and chemicals and all these other processes, as a matter of necessity, there is a huge degree to which this stuff is done by amateurs, quote unquote, is like part of sort of like collaborative networks, mutual aid, all of these kinds of things that are very accessible to us. And so in terms of sort of doing like quote unquote like science for the people, this is a scientific field that is very open to participation. And I think is kind of encouraging because it allows us to intervene and experiment in ways that most of the systems that are organized in our society do not. And in that way, they encourage a lot of apathy. So, you know, essentially, you, the listener, or myself, or any of us, can just kind of go out and start doing this by just like connecting to an amateur network and getting on with it. Which is something that, like, in terms of like adaptive solutions to the climate crisis or the civilizational crisis that we're in right now, is generally not the case, right? And so it's very encouraging in that sense, and it's very open, and it does kind of blast open our perceptions of agency in our current society as well, right? Like, yes, these things can be co-opted by capitalism, like we saw with that one firm that's patented everything and blah blah blah. But like, you know, we can just kind of take the initiative and do this stuff, and hopefully the sort of peculiarities and diversities of the fungal world will help to mitigate against capitalist homogenization, capture, and commodification, in a sense, right? So I don't know. Let's see what we can do with it, right? Is kind of the message here.
Yeah, in the same way that like the fungi themselves seem to often be able to escape our attempts to capture them. Like they kind of refuse to be domesticated. Like, you know, the hyphal tips, they can just split in two and route around something, take two directions at once rather than getting trapped. I think we could take a lot of inspiration from these things, you know. They seem to live a happier life than we do.
yeah, they're prey, not necessarily so much, but they do, yes.
Thank you for listening to General Intellect Unit. While you wait for the next episode, you can find us on Twitter at GIUnitPod. You can find us on Facebook. We're on the internet at generalintellectunit.net, and we're on all the podcast apps. If you'd like to support the show, help keep us alive, and get access to our community Discord, you can go to patreon.com/generalintellectunit and give us a couple of bucks a month. Every contribution is greatly appreciated. This show is part of the Emancipation Network, a Marxist podcast network and research collective. Go to emancipation.network and check out our sister shows, such as From Alpha to Omega, Jumpsuit Utopia, Swampside Chats, and Mortal Science. They're all excellent shows and excellent folks. As always, thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed this show, and we hope you'll join us again next time.